A visible pattern appears in public environments where individuals with damaged reputations engage in disproportionately strong signaling behaviors. The intensity of these signals often exceeds the scale of the original issue, creating a noticeable overcompensation in public actions. Observers interpret this as deliberate effort to rebuild trust, reinforcing the visibility of the behavior. A common explanation assumes this is driven by internal urgency to restore credibility. Under this view, individuals simply try harder after reputational damage, increasing effort until perception improves. The behavior appears proportional to the need for recovery, suggesting a straightforward correction process. This explanation fails to account for why signaling intensity continues to escalate even after visible recovery milestones are reached. If recovery were the only driver, signaling should taper once baseline trust is restored. Instead, signaling persists or amplifies, indicating a mismatch between observed behavior and expected stopping point. The breakdown becomes clearer when comparing cases where reputation loss is minor, but signaling response is extreme. The scale of response does not track the original event but tracks something else entirely. This inconsistency exposes a missing variable in the explanation. The underlying system operates under asymmetric memory retention, where negative signals persist longer in public memory than positive recovery signals. Reputation loss is recorded with high durability, while recovery signals decay faster or require repetition to register. This creates an incentive imbalance between loss and recovery. Under this structure, maintaining baseline reputation requires more signaling effort than the initial loss required. Individuals must generate multiple visible signals to offset a single negative event. The cost of inaction becomes persistent reputation drag. Rational actors respond by increasing the frequency and intensity of visible corrective actions. Instead of matching the original issue, they optimize for memory overwrite through repeated signaling. Behavior shifts from correction to signal saturation. As more individuals adopt this strategy, the public signal environment becomes inflated. High-intensity signaling becomes the new baseline for perceived normal behavior. Lower-intensity signals are discounted or ignored. A contrast emerges between actual behavioral correction and visible signaling output. The system rewards visibility of recovery more than the substance of change. This shifts optimization away from underlying behavior towards signal production. The inflation creates a competitive dynamic where each actor must exceed the signaling level of others to be noticed. Relative visibility becomes more important than absolute improvement. Signal escalation becomes a strategic necessity. At this point, actors who do not overcorrect are systematically disadvantaged. Their signals fail to register against the inflated baseline. They remain trapped in perceived low reputation states despite neutral behavior. The system further reinforces overcorrection because each new signal contributes to short-term visibility but not long-term memory replacement. Signals must be continuously produced to maintain presence. This creates a dependency on ongoing signaling activity. A second contrast appears between initial recovery and sustained reputation maintenance. Recovery appears achievable in bursts, but stability requires continuous signaling investment. The system separates recovery from maintenance costs. Over time, the signaling layer decouples from actual behavior entirely. Actors maintain high visibility regardless of underlying changes. Perception becomes driven by signal frequency rather than substance. This decoupling introduces distortion into public evaluation mechanisms. Observers rely on signal density as a proxy for trustworthiness. The proxy becomes self-reinforcing. As the system scales, new entrants must immediately adopt inflated signaling norms to avoid early disadvantage. Baseline behavior is no longer sufficient for neutral perception. Entry cost into normal reputation status increases. A third contrast emerges between historical reputation and current signaling. Past negative signals retain influence despite high current signaling output. The system never fully resets. Actors respond by sustaining overcompensation indefinitely rather than aiming for closure. Reputation becomes an ongoing maintenance problem rather than a recoverable state. The time horizon of adaptation extends. The accumulation of these dynamics leads to a stable equilibrium where all participants engage in signal inflation. High signaling becomes necessary to offset asymmetric memory effects. Behavior standardizes around overcompensation. In this equilibrium, reputation is no longer anchored to underlying actions but to continuous signal output. Public perception is maintained through visible effort rather than actual state. The system stabilizes in a state of persistent overcorrection. As signal inflation stabilizes, the time horizon mismatch becomes more pronounced. Public memory retains negative signals across long intervals, while recovery signals decay unless continuously refreshed. Actors must operate on a shorter signaling cycle than the system's memory cycle, increasing the frequency requirement for visible actions. This mismatch forces a compression of behavioral cycles. Instead of spacing actions based on actual change, actors cluster signals tightly to maintain presence within the retention window. The system shifts toward high-frequency signaling bursts as a survival condition. As multiple actors adopt this compressed cycle, signal density rises further. Each individual's attempt to stay visible increases background noise for others. The threshold for what counts as noticeable signaling moves upward. This creates a feedback loop where increased noise reduces the effectiveness of each individual signal. Actors respond by further intensifying or multiplying signals to overcome the noise floor. Signal inflation accelerates as a collective adaptation. At this stage, information asymmetry becomes structurally embedded. Observers cannot distinguish between genuine behavioral change and repeated signaling patterns. Signal quantity replaces signal quality as the dominant input for evaluation. A contrast emerges between observable effort and unverifiable substance. The system processes only what is visible, ignoring what cannot be externally validated. Actors optimize for visibility, not underlying transformation. This distortion tightens the constraint on signaling strategies. Low frequency or subtle signals become non-viable, regardless of actual improvement. Behavior converges toward exaggerated and repetitive signaling formats. As the system scales, early-stage actors encounter immediate exposure to this inflated baseline. They must begin at a higher signaling intensity to avoid falling below visibility thresholds. Entry into neutral reputation status becomes more resource-intensive. The feedback loop extends across time as well as across actors. Past signals accumulate unevenly, requiring continuous counter-signaling to maintain balance. The cost of maintaining equilibrium grows with the length of recorded history. This accumulation creates a form of signaling debt. Each negative signal increases the future signaling requirement disproportionately. Actors become locked into long-term overcompensation cycles. A second contrast appears between temporary recovery and sustained equilibrium. Short bursts of signaling can temporarily shift perception, but do not reset accumulated memory. Actors must continue signaling beyond visible recovery to prevent regression. This persistence introduces rigidity into the system. Actors cannot safely reduce signaling without risking a delayed reactivation of negative memory. Behavior becomes path-dependent on prior signaling intensity. At this point, reducing signal output is interpreted as a negative signal itself. Absence of visibility is treated as absence of correction. Actors lose the option to disengage from signaling without penalty. The system reinforces itself through this constraint tightening. Every actor's continued signaling validates the expectation that signaling must be continuous. Deviation becomes increasingly costly, and analytical tension appears in the evaluation layer. It is not fully clear whether increasing signal volume actually improves long-term reputation stability or merely sustains short-term visibility. Yet actors continue escalating because the alternative guarantees immediate disadvantage. This uncertainty does not break the loop but intensifies it. Actors hedge by increasing signaling further to avoid downside risk. The system shifts toward overproduction as a dominant strategy. Over time, the equilibrium hardens into a state where reputation maintenance requires constant signal output, regardless of underlying behavior. The original purpose of signaling, to reflect change, becomes secondary to its function as a visibility mechanism. The system locks into persistent overcompensation driven by asymmetric memory retention. In this stabilized state, the system no longer rewards quiet behavioral correction. It rewards sustained visibility, repeated signaling, and continuous presence in the public layer. Actions that do not generate visible signals are effectively ignored, regardless of their underlying substance. Before, a single corrective action could restore balance over time. Now, absence of signaling is interpreted as absence of correction, even if behavior has already changed. The system penalizes inactivity more consistently than it rewards completion. As a result, actors no longer optimize for resolving the original issue. They optimize for maintaining signal flow to prevent negative memory from regaining dominance. Stopping becomes riskier than continuing, locking behavior into ongoing overcompensation. The equilibrium shifts from reputation recovery to reputation maintenance through constant output. What matters is not whether the issue is resolved, but whether the signal remains active in the system. Behavior stabilizes around continuous signaling as the only viable way to hold position. Under this equilibrium, reputation is no longer a state that can be restored and left behind. It becomes a condition that must be actively sustained through visible effort at all times. The system enforces overcompensation as the default behavior because the incentive structure makes